In the previous video, I provided you with a very, very brief introduction to some of the key theories and ideas and key figures that ultimately contributed to understanding of evolutionary theory today. Now what we want to do is shift from looking at the theory itself and its core principles to looking at how it can be applied to understanding modern or contemporary human variation. And in particular, we're going to be looking at the construction of race. Now, just a heads up that I'm going to be very critical of the concept of race, and you're going to see this is largely because while many people have the idea that races are a biological fact, that they are a biological reality, what you're going to see, what I'm going to argue is that indeed this is not true, that racial classification systems are culturally based, and while they use biological traits and are argued to be biological in basis, they do not reflect the reality of what variation means and how our populations work. So, without further ado, let's get into this. So I don't want to spend too much time talking about some of the historical views, but just recall that evolutionary theory itself resulted from people just trying to understand the world around us, not just biological variation. We talked about how it was used to help classify life on our planet, but also to understand change in our environment around us and attempt to understand the relationship that organisms have with their environments as well. And so understanding human variation was also a key part of these early discussions. And if we turn to the archaeological record, and we can see that many societies have stories and tales and understandings, different kinds of understandings about why people look differently and have different traits in different parts of the world or even within populations. Now, a lot of the earliest systems that attempted to kind of classify or organize people on the basis of their physical appearance did focus on skin color. And as I mentioned in the notes here, that skin color is just something that's really noticeable, right? It's easy to detect, and so it was something, and easy to see, so it was something that people picked up on. And so here's an example of how Egyptians were classifying people on the basis of skin color. We see this represented in their various art forms. We know that this would continue and be ongoing as part of the colonization efforts as European political states, right, went across the world and sought new lands and established new colonies. And of course, this kind of age of exploration that happened was actually really critical in formulating some of these early theories as well, because it just increased, again, these largely European thinkers' understanding of human diversity and just seeing just how diverse humans actually were. Now, one of our earliest racial classification system actually comes to us from Linnaeus, and you'll remember from the previous video and the previous notes that Linnaeus provided us with the Systema Naturae. He provided us a system of organizing and sorting and classifying all life on Earth, and humans were part of this classification system. He's often, and this system is often recognized as the kind of first scientific attempt to describe this variation that was now being seen and being reported back from the 16th century and the 1600s, and so into the 17th century as well. And so, again, it was his taxonomic classification system, and he placed humans into 4 major racial categories. There was actually a 5th one, the so-called wild men, but this one is one that's a little bit more problematic. It doesn't show up later on, and it seems to kind of acknowledge that it was kind of based more on some kind of early or fantastical reports of human-like species, but doesn't actually represent human variation. And you can see that they're kind of based on a subspecies designation, and also based largely on kind of continental divides as well, right? So Homo sapiens Afar was Africans, Homo sapiens Americanus was American Indians, Homo sapiens Asiaticus was Asians, so the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, and then Homo sapiens Europaeus for Europeans. The next major classification system, and one that heavily influenced anthropological thought, so this is the one I want to spend a bit more time on, is that of Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. is that Blumenbach, who's a German anatomist, he also classified humans into racial categories. And you can see that he actually expanded and it was based on Linnaeus's. And what he essentially did was separated out a group from Asiaticus, so from Asians, into Malaysian. And you can see he has some different terminology that he's used here. And again, I mentioned that the reason why I want to focus on Blumenbach's classification is that he's considered to be one of the fathers of biological anthropology. And the reason for this is that his classification system was not based so much on skin color as it was based on skeletal anatomy, in particular his analysis of several hundred skulls that he had collected from around the world. And this is where I have to talk about kind of ethics in anthropology and the kind of harsh reality of our history in anthropology is that yes, human skulls and human remains for a significant period in scientific past and anthropology's past were collected from around the world without the consent of descendant populations and were used for analysis and were often used to fuel the colonial and honestly kind of racist ideologies that were present in Europe at that time. And so he studied these skulls. This is one of the images here. He looked at variations in the traits, and he concluded, as I mentioned, that there were 5 races of people. Now, he argued that these types were static, that is, that they did not change over time. And he argued that it was important to use other criteria, particularly skeletal anatomy, because racial categories based on skin color were fairly arbitrary, and that many traits, including skin color, show overlapping expression between groups. So he was getting at what I mentioned in the other video, that a lot of variation in humans, including skin color, represents clinal variation. So there's this kind of continuum that there's not discrete units, right? So, for example, if we want to use white as a skin color, well, what is white? How do we define it? We can do an exercise in class to this end on Friday as well to talk about it. But the key thing about Blumenbach's work is not only that he was using skeletal traits and arguing for other anatomical traits to use to classify humans into races, but he very much set the tone for the popular perception of human variation, which is that human beings do have categories, exist in these types called races. And so this idea would persist for a long period of time. And note that actually, ironically, his racial categories would often become associated with skin color classifications. And this just kind of shows how heavily influence our culture has on understanding biological variation. So this idea of humans as being classifiable into races persisted well into, as you can see, into the turn of the 20th century, into the earliest phase of the 20th century, and where we finally start to see, in particular, anthropologists like Ashley Montagu, in particular, who became very opposed to these race-based classification systems, arguing that these terms don't actually have scientific validity. What he was arguing is that, again, largely because of the declinal variation in expression of our biological traits, that it is virtually impossible to classify us into distinct categories, that the variations we're seeing is the result of, again, natural selection, of population differences, and importantly, that culture played a key role. So he advocated for the use of the term ethnic group. Now, he didn't create this term, but he liked this term because it was much more anthropological in practice, right? Because it recognized that the human groups, the ways that we classify humans, were not just on the basis of biology, but often reflected cultural values. Now, I don't capture this in the notes, and again, we talk about this more in our classes like Anth101 or biological anthropology, where we do go into how these systems were derived and how they were changed over time. But if you even look at the work of Linnaeus, for example, you see very quickly that it's not just biological traits used in this classification, but he was taking his own cultural understandings of things like personality traits and stereotypes, essentially, and applying them to these populations as well. So what Montagu was saying was that essentially that this is more reflective of actually how human groups are organized, that we shouldn't be relying on our perceptions of biological variation, but rather focus on defining groups based on their sociological, cultural, and linguistic traits, right? So political organization, economic organization, religious practice, worldview, the languages, etc., etc. And the work of Montague, the reason why I'm focusing on him, so he's not the only anthropologist who was arguing for this at this time, was that Montague played a significant role in, again, combating this idea of race as being biological in notion. His work has had a large impact on how we view race today, and he actually had a hand in coming up with the United Nations Statement on Race in the 1950s, and had a hand in developing the American Anthropological Association Statement on Race as well. So what is race then if it's not a biological concept, if it's not something that we can validate and we have enough evidence from biology to support its existence? Well, that means then it is a cultural construct, right? And the reality is that for many individuals, race is an everyday fact of their life, right? What race are you? What ethnicity are you? We hear what is your background? We have a whole bunch of language around this. We capture this data in our censuses and other ways of recording people's identities. And we know so much that this has significant consequences on the lived experience of many people and groups of peoples as well, right? This is not something new. So it's not that race does not exist, but simply that race is not biological. It's rather a cultural construct. So one of the anthropological pieces that I think is really useful is the work of Tony Marks in 1994, who described that basically race is often used, particularly in the West, as a system of folk heredity. And an example of this would be kind of the politeness formula that we see used here in Canada, which is like, oh, where is your family from? Where are your ancestors from? Where are you originally from, right? Where are your origins? And essentially what we need to ask the person is, what is your race, right? What is your identity? And so basically the system of folk heredity then is it's a system of identification that we generally accept in a society. It's something we've informally learned through childhood. And again, it allows us to then classify individuals into various groups that our society has defined. However, it doesn't always work. So for example, some classification systems, racial classification systems, don't really account for quote unquote mixed races very well, whereas others actually have numerous. The Brazilian system, for example, has numerous, I think it's like 50 plus racial categories that deal with a variety of different kinds of, again, ancestries and backgrounds and skin colors, and actually socioeconomic class is a critical piece of the racial classification system. So again, this is what I wanted to emphasize, is that while we tend to perceive of race as being biological in nature, that because our variation is clinal, there are not these natural boundaries between us, right? The divisions that we make, for example, on things like skin color, are arbitrary, right? And they often reflect, again, bias that we have in our societies. The traits that we use in these classification systems are also arbitrary as well. So again, I didn't go into much detail about this, but for example, Linnaeus' system didn't just use skin color, but it used things like nose shape, forehead profile, I think even ear shape was on there, overall size of the cranium, and then again, other elements of more like what we might call personality or behavioral traits versus like biological or anatomical traits are also utilized, right? If we're using it as a system of folk heredity, then trying to get at things like ancestry, well, what parent then defines what race you are? And one of the products of colonialism, for example, is the use of blood quantum mechanics here to assign people's identity, that if you have a certain percentage of quote-unquote blood or ancestry from a particular population or particular race, then therefore that designates you as belonging to that, or inversely prevents you from belonging to a particular group because you now are being assigned a formal membership in another race. The broader issue, of course, is when do you stop? How many races are there? And of course we interbreed, right? We are a single species, and this is something really critical to note, right? Is that this means that, you know, it increases the clinal variation that we have because it's redistributing the frequency of alleles within or between populations as well. So this is what anthropologists mean when we say that biological race is not real. So race certainly is real. Race has very important real-world consequences, but race is not a biological fact, right? And again, It is also meaningless if we start to look more in depth at genetic variation, for example. So if we want to say, okay, well, we're going to use these specific alleles in order to assign people to different populations, and so presence or absence of these alleles, or I shouldn't say presence or absence of these alleles, but certain phenotypes within it, is that studies have shown that, for example, we have more genetic variation found often within so-called races than between them. The distribution of some traits does not match the distribution of others, right? So, for example, another trait that was often used in early racial classification systems was hair type. And while we may see some correlations between skin colors, certain skin colors and certain hair types, it's not consistent, and it doesn't always match each other the way it should if biological race, if these discrete units actually existed, which they don't. Now, most of these folks' taxonomies or these folks' systems are based on skin color, so I thought it was important to talk about this, and we can go over this a little bit more in class on Friday, but I just wanted to provide a bit of background in terms of, well, how is our how is skin color formed? Like, what is skin color the product of? Well, and it is an adaptive response, as I state here, shaped by natural selection. In the notes below, I go into a little bit more detail in terms of the three factors that determine our skin colors. And what I wanted to point out to you here is this image on the side, and this is a color chart that was used in a racial classification system. And what you can see is that the idea is that everyone's skin type should fall under these 36 types. But in every classroom I've ever shown this in, and we've tried to do examples, is many individuals saying, well, what about me? I don't fit on here. I'm not an exact match with these. So where does this place me? Do I just simply not exist? Am I not human? Am I some sort of radical variation? No, what it's trying to show is that the dividing lines between these are completely arbitrary. Some other things we have to factor in, I think, by looking at skin color is that it really emphasizes that, again, many of these traits are not just the product of our genetics, of heritability, but also, of course, by the other principle of natural selection, which is by the selective factors and pressures of the environments in which we exist. And it's important to note that skin color is influenced quite readily by our proximity to the equator. And why is that? It's because it determines essentially how much UV we are exposed to, and our skin color, and particularly the production of melanin in the skin increases our sun protection factor. And so the more melanin you have, the higher your sun protector or SPF factor is. So people with a darker skin can have an SPF factor between 10 to 15, and people with light skin have an SPF factor of 2 to 3. Well, why do we care about SPS factors? Well, as we know, as we start to head into hopefully our spring and then our summer and much more sunlight and stuff, is that having a higher SPS factor of our skin naturally means that it prevents not only damage to our skin, which is one of our most important organs, it protects us, right? So there's a number of different functions. It also helps prevent the destruction of folic acid, which is important in cellular division. It helps protect us from developing skin cancers. However, it's not always advantageous to have darker skin. There was a study that came out of the University of Toronto showing that one of the reasons why international students from countries associated and aligned along the equator often experience like seasonal affective disorder and depression, but also might have health issues when they migrate to Canada to go to university, is that basically being in a northern climate means that we don't actually have a lot of good exposure to sunlight, which means that we don't synthesize a lot of vitamin D on our skin. So a lot of our dairy products, for example, have vitamin D added to it to ensure that we're getting the necessary levels that we need for appropriate bone growth, and vitamin D is good for a whole bunch of other things as well. And so in northern climates where we have less exposure to sunlight and UV radiation, being able to synthesize more vitamin D on the skin through having lighter skin pigmentation is a selective advantage. So again, when we look at skin color variation, we can start to see that it reflects basically it's a product of adaptation to our environment. And the fact that humans are found so expansively all over the globe on every continent means that we've had to adapt to the wide variety of environments. And we'll talk about this when we talk about primates, is that that's one of the things that really is an advantage that humans have over all other non-human primates, is our ability to live everywhere. And part of it is because of the variations that we have in our populations, and the ability to have different skin pigmentation and to have this clinal variation. Of course, our interaction with the environment is not limited to just skin color, but other things like body size and limb proportions are also influenced by our environment, in particular climate. So so slender bodies, tall bodies with longer limbs tend to be associated with warmer climates, and that has to do with the dissipation of heat and having less surface area, again, in these high UV environments, whereas we have more robust and shorter bodies and shorter limbs with wider surface areas in environments with less UV radiation. So it's a complex factor of not just impacting skin color, but other attributes that allow us, again, to adapt and survive in these various kinds of environment. We have to remember, however, that environmental stress is also dealt with through cultural adaptation. So what are some examples of these? Come up with these and we'll talk about them in class. And I mean, we're now into spring number 3, and I'm sure you'll have many kinds of examples of this. And it's just important to note that one of the things that we see when we examine human evolution is that indeed our cultural adaptation has removed a lot of selective pressures on human populations, and particularly environmental stresses, and has removed it as a selective pressure on human populations. So we'll kind of talk about some of those consequences as well. In terms of environmental stress, we also have to consider about the other ways that we have adapted to change and adapt to our environments. And so climatization is one. Now, this is not something that is an adaptation in terms of being selected for per se, but rather that we do have at the individual level responses often reversible to short-term changes in our environment, right? So those of us with lighter skin pigmentation will often darken in the sun via tanning. If you go to higher altitudes or higher elevations that you're not used to, given time, you will be able to adapt to the lower oxygen levels, and part of this is because your body will start to produce a higher amount of red blood cells in it. The reason why talking about race as non-biological becomes so complicated is because of the conflation we have, because we use race as a system of folk heredity between race and ancestry. And so I just want to note that in anthropology, we don't use race to capture ancestry without looking at very specific applications. And the two specific applications are in medical and forensic fields. And this, again, is meant to reflect the social understanding of how race operates. So while biological race is not a biological reality, ancestry certainly is. And we can trace ancestral relationships between individuals and between populations through DNA. And this is where, again, the modern genetic synthesis, the modern evolutionary synthesis was so critical because it allowed us to do this. As we saw in the 5 Fingers of Evolution video, we have to remember that humans are divided into breeding populations, and this, of course, impacts gene flow, right, or the distribution of certain alleles and the frequency of those alleles within populations. So again, race then is very important in that it is a social construction, right? And it can include a number of different factors that are used, which may include biological traits, right? But often include more, again, what Ashley Montague said in terms of ethnic groups, those sociological factors, right? So religion, class, etc., etc. So ethnicity then is the term that we use when we're looking at classifying people primarily based on, again, these sociological or cultural attributes, right? So things like language, culture, or faith, and they need not include shared ancestry. And again, I use the term Hispanic here, but I know it's not commonly used as much anymore here, but that's just one example of a term that was used to represent a group of people who share culture, language, and often religion, but may have various ancestry points. Jewish is another term, and a lot of, again, faith-based groups, even Christian, right, is not explicitly linked with any particular social race, but it may be here in the West, but it may be in other particular contexts. Now, the reason why, of course, anthropologists care about race has a lot to do with how race is used as a social divider. Right? It's one of the ways that we construct difference, and it influences the perception and interactions between various sorts of groups and results in racism. And unfortunately, because of the scientific attempts to classify people on the basis of race, this history has persisted in terms of other ways that we have, again, examined difference between various populations. And IQ tests, for example, have been heavily influenced by racial classification systems, and unfortunately been used to reiterate many racist ideologies as well. So what I wanted to emphasize in Chapter 7 talks about this in your book, that there is no single way to define or measure human intelligence, that the variations we see in IQ scores and IQ tests reflect a lot of, again, cultural differences in cultural knowledge and education and social class. And again, we can talk more about this in class on Friday, because I have quite a few of you will be interested in this, because I know there's a lot of IQ tests you can do online and stuff like that, and we'll talk about how these things are shared. And then the last thing I want to talk about in our class on Friday is some of these different examples of how race operates in other parts of the world. And this is where that anthropological perspective, in particular ethnology or cross-cultural comparison, becomes really important, because when we start to look at how other cultures classify and define races, we start to see that, yes, it really is shaped by culture much more so than a set biological understanding of what race is. So we'll look at race in Japan, race in the United States, and race in Brazil. And of course, we can also talk about race here in Canada as well. So I look forward to having a discussion with you folks on Friday. So take care until then, and I will see you then.